And welcome to our second panel of the first Oceania Regional Conference, the Platypus Affiliated Society, What Was Neoliberalism? For those of you who are unaware of what the Platypus Affiliated Society is, it was established in December 2006, and we organised reading groups, public fora, research and journalism focused on the problems and tasks inherited from the old 1920s and 30s, new 1960s and 70s, and post-political 1980s and 90s left, for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. If you're interested in finding out some more, we have some copies of our journal, our monthly journal, the Platypus Review, out on those tables. And we also have a podcast, Ship Platypus Says. So I'll run through a little bit of housekeeping before we kick off. Fire escapes, where the signs are, they're on the inside of the door. The bathrooms are across the courtyard, through there. And questions will be taken at the end. So there'll be a mic that will go around. I just ask that the questions be brief and to the point. And if you have any longer statements that you'd like to make, we are able to, to present them as perhaps being appropriate for the Platypus Review publication. Also, before we kick off, after this there will be an event at the Clyde across the road in sort of a more social context. So I'll go on to talk about our panelists tonight. First, I'd like to introduce. Quentin Findlay, who's been employed by NUPE, the National Union of Public Employees, as a full-time union organiser since 2013. He was previously employed by the Department of Courts, Parliament, and NZEI at the Lincoln University Students Association. He has a PhD in political history, specialising in the early history of the NZ Labour Party from Lincoln University. He has lectured in politics at the University of Otago and Lincoln University. He also tutors in politics, history and political economy at CWEA, the Canterbury Workers' Educational Association. Chris Dite is a teacher, socialist and unionist. He helped organise the successful campaign against the East-West Link toll road and unionised readings bookshops across Melbourne as a member of the RAFFWU. He has written for Jacobin magazine, Overland and Radical Philosophy. Guy Rundle is currently an editor of Arena, which he has co-edited on and off since 1992. He has been a correspondent for many publications, a producer and writer for television and stage, and was a co-founder of the Victorian Socialists. His most recent book is Red Light Blown, Is America a Cult? And finally we have Ryan, who's a member of the Platypus Affiliated Society, chapter here in the University of Melbourne. He participated in the Bernie Sanders electoral campaign in 2016 and 2020. So I'll move on to addressing the content of the talk tonight and read out the prompt. The apparent crack-up of the global political order of the last 25 years formed a backdrop for the radicalisation of a new generation, the Millennials, who turned to the left in an attempt to understand capitalism anew and exploit its crisis in order to change it. We might trace their conception of the moment's political possibilities through its concrete manifestations. In the anti-imperialism of the Iraq War protests, the anti-globalization discontents resurfacing internationally in Occupy, and the turn to neo-social democratic organisations following the failure of prefigurative politics. Looking back at the first quarter of the 21st century, one might ask why the Millennial Left may have missed the opportunity to intervene in the transformation of capitalism with a politics of its own. The articulation of a post-neoliberal politics in Trump's second term seems to suggest the Millennials' misrecognition of neoliberalism's crisis for its reconsolidation. So Platypus asks, what was neoliberalism and what did it mean? So we'll move on to opening remarks, which will be 10 minutes. Beg your pardon. So first I'd like to invite Quentin Findlay to speak, please.
Thank you. Well, I don't know exactly what to actually say to actually start this off, but essentially I suppose, as I said, that I'm from New Zealand. New Zealand had the unfortunate circumstance to actually be essentially experience neoliberalism in 1984 at the bequest actually of a Labour government and so on at that point in time, some of which I talked about in my comments before, but I largely didn't talk about neoliberalism and so on because I knew that this was coming up. Now, essentially what I will say is that, like most countries throughout the Western world and so on after World War II, New Zealand governments of whatever stripe, whether or not they be National or the Tories or Labour, essentially practiced social democracy. So essentially they practiced a economic system that was Keynesian in terms of its outlook. There was government regulation. There was essentially too a commitment to full employment, high wages through unions and through compulsory arbitration and awards. There was also a commitment and so on to high benefit rates and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Throughout the 1970s, essentially there was a move, one could actually say, this coincided and so on with various economic crises and so on at the time in the country, to actually move away from this. And you saw it became obvious, first of all, and probably criticism of then Prime Minister Robert Muldoon's sort of policies and so on. Muldoon was very much of a conventional, arrogant, very arrogant Keynesian. But essentially there were increased criticisms of the way he ran the economy, which was essentially heavily regulated, particularly in the late 1970s, and essentially a move and so on from a number of his supporters, essentially Bob Jones and so on and others who have been National Party supporters, to actually move towards a free market system. At the same time, basically Treasury, the New Zealand Treasury, had been won over and so on by the debates and so on that were occurring overseas, and actually a number of their advisors had also been won over to the neoliberal position. The interesting thing, of course, was Muldoon, of course, distrusted Treasury immensely and actually criticised them severely on the basis of this. However, the Labour opposition at the time was not so, let us say, opposed to what was happening, and particularly so David Logie and more so Roger Douglas, who was his who became Minister of Finance. Both of these people, particularly Douglas, became adherents to neoliberalism and so on. And when Labour finally did achieve government in 1984, after essentially David Logie became leader, he basically made Roger Douglas and so on the Minister of Finance. Now, Treasury and so on basically had presented the incoming government with a book called, I think it was called Government Management. What government management actually said, economic management, what it essentially said was that the economy had failed under the Keynesian apparatus, and that really what was needed was wholesale corporatisation, privatisation, deregulation, and of course, basically the removal and so on of commitments to things like full employment. And in the end, the market should actually basically determine these things. Over the next 3 years, the Labour government systematically dismantled the public sector in New Zealand, essentially through a number of the basically what you could say Keynesian policies, particularly around employment and so on, to the wind, which led, of course, to essentially widespread sort of economic dislocation and, of course, social dislocation and so on as well. In 1987, the government was re-elected and essentially again continued on and so on with this program, and this happened and so on at this point to go further into the public sector, and that was, of course, looking at things like, for example, education, where it implemented a number of reports. Up to this point, for example, university students paid only a nominal fee to attend university, and of course they got full bursaries. The Labour government decided that essentially would be best to look at, for example, charging students full fees, or to have a student loans program, or in fact to have some sort of graduate tax and so on as well. These essentially were part and so on of reports that were presented. Also, the government began to look at things like industrial relations. It passed the Labour Relations Act, and Roger Douglas had made it also very clear that he was very much in favour of deregulation of the labour sector, because New Zealand had compulsory unionism, it still had awards. Douglas felt that essentially these should actually be basically given to the market as well. Labour was essentially unceremoniously deposed in the 1990 election, but the incoming national government, headed by Jim Bolger, with the Finance Minister Ruth Richardson, essentially carried on with those reforms. Ruth Richardson, as I said just before, this is in my sort of spiel before, basically implemented something called the mother of all budgets in 1991, and what she did was essentially cut benefits, cut wages, and essentially announced wholesale privatisation and so on, whatever key assets were left. In 1992, the government also basically finished off the union movement by essentially implementing the Employment Contracts Act, which effectively, as I said, wrote unions out of the law. So essentially unions went from a situation where in fact they had basically awards and a guaranteed legal status to a situation where they had none. The government's response to this, after nearly losing the 1993 election, was to essentially fudge it. And so for the next 25 years, New Zealand experienced neoliberalism, but essentially in a very, very slow form. The government didn't move much and so on beyond that, and essentially it essentially stopped most of the major sales and so on, not that it was not to sell off and so on after that, though it did continue and so on with reforms in tertiary areas and so on like that. As of the last election, New Zealand has been gifted with a National Act New Zealand First coalition government. Essentially, if I could term the first, the period between 1984 to 1992, even though it was National Labour, I term them as the First Act administration, because essentially the policies and so on were virtually the same during that period from both parties. This is definitely the Second Act administration, where the Act government has essentially taken over the leadership of the coalition government. The Prime Minister, Chris Luxton, has been rendered basically mute. And basically the government has again essentially flicked the switch and basically gone ahead with what they left off on in 1992. So New Zealand is now staring at a wholesale raft of reforms and basically the proposal of the sale of more public assets, basically massive labour reforms, again, which threaten the existence of labour unions, and of course, they basically take away a lot of the rights and so on that were returned to unions under the Employment Relations Act. And of course, they've also suggested too various other reforms and so on too, which will have far-reaching consequences. And I'm thinking particularly of the Regulatory Standards Bill, which will basically impose neoliberalism into the centre of government decision-making, whether or not you wanted it or you didn't, and will make basically David Seymour, the leader of ACT, the actual in all extents and purposes, the leader of the government, because every economic decision would have to go through him and be managed by that bill. So that's essentially where we are in New Zealand. We've done things and so on that even Margaret Thatcher said essentially that she could not actually get away with and so on in the United Kingdom. We did them first, we did them before Bob Hawke, and the result of this has been basically massive dislocation, basically massive alienation, low productivity, high unemployment, and a whole lot of other glorious things that essentially that 40 years ago we were told would not be happening because we'd be living in some sort of South Seas paradise at this point in time, none of which has panned out. As for, basically the effect of neoliberalism and so on the politics and so on of New Zealand, I think it would be fair to say that New Zealand's political parties have been moved to the right, and very substantially so, where in fact the Labour Party believe in things like, for example, the standard social democratic maxims of free health, free education, and so on, now seen as dangerously communist, whereas, to actually believe in the free market is seen as relatively sane. And that's what.
Thank you very much. If we could move on to Chris Dite, please.
Thanks. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, I think it's a very big prompt, actually. What was neoliberalism and what does it mean? What did it mean for millennials? So I think I've just focused on things that I think are interesting, but hopefully other people think they are too. I think neoliberalism is easiest to understand as a kind of loose international consensus about how to deal with a crisis of profitability. I think you've got this situation in the sort of late 60s and 70s where you've got, inflation, slowing growth, falling profits, and you've got numerous actors kind of concluding that the answer to that and the way to restore profitability is to kind of, for the state to forge these sort of, I guess, what would you call it, institutional frameworks or scaffolds or something for like freer markets, stronger private property, things like that. And also actively generating new markets by basically dismantling the welfare state and the publicly owned sections of the economy. I think everybody knows, everyone in this room is from different places, so everyone knows that this sort of loose international consensus kind of played out differently in different places. And obviously it's super interesting to focus on different regions and locations, but I don't really want to do that actually. I want to focus on a different aspect of it. I think not only did it play out differently in different places like New Zealand and UK, US, Australia and stuff, but it also gave rise to, I think, a really volatile situation actually. Like you've got sort of this really vulnerable configuration, I guess, of like sort of interlinked corporate assets. We saw kind of what happened to that in 2008. But I really think neoliberalism also gave rise to kind of what is really one of the defining things of the world today, which is a sort of inter-capitalist competition that threatens to spill over into a kind of open war, the likes of which the world's never seen. So I kind of want to focus maybe a bit more on that. So I think obviously like completely cannibalizing the welfare state comes with some risks attached, I suppose. So if you're planning on embarking on a project of sort of wage suppression, basically destroying the social safety net, kind of, I guess, restoring the reserve army of labour to its more like natural disciplining role, if that's what your plan is, the potential for that to lead to kind of greater social unrest is super high, right? So I think alongside all these structural kind of counter reforms that were embarked on in the neoliberal period, there was also, I think, a recognition by a lot of the ruling class that there was a kind of need to incorporate undeveloped parts of the world into the kind of wider economic system to sort of offset some of those risks. And I want to focus a little bit on that because I think these sort of imperatives that emerged in neoliberalism also dovetailed really nicely with a set of crises, I guess, or needs or issues facing the Chinese Communist Party. And I think ultimately, a super defining factor that's led us to where we are today is that the PRC was able to meet some of those needs of the West and offer the kind of global capitalist system, not just like territory for investment, but also a really massive pool of educated, relatively healthy workers. Bigger, actually, I think, a bigger workforce than all the industrial nations put together. With the added bonus that the kind of production and reproduction of that workforce was met by a different system, at least for a little time, maybe not anymore. I also think the whole reform and opening up period is really interesting. I think it's a bit similar to neoliberalism in a way, in that it's kind of like a label given to something that makes it sound like it was this like perfectly hatched evil plan in advance, but I'm not totally sure that's what it was. I think it's more like a label put onto a series of solutions that the ruling class came up with to deal with a set of kind of local crises or whatever. I just want to quickly talk about the kind of aftermath of that decision to open up in that way. I think obviously the aftermath of the reform and opening up period led to this accumulation of capital on a really like massive scale actually, which inevitably kind of led to this search for sort of foreign escape valves, I guess you might say, which led to kind of all sorts of unstable arrangements, if you want to call it that. I think US debt needed creditors, and excessively accumulated Chinese capital kind of found an outlet in US treasuries. You know, this was positive in a way because it sort of increased demand for Chinese goods and helped peg the RMB to the USD. There's positive in that. Obviously, there's huge risks involved in that as well, and China kind of dealt with those risks by undervaluing its currency. This obviously affects the quality of life of Chinese people because it makes imports more expensive, but also involved this like really insane dance that went on for like quite some time actually, where you've got sort of the Chinese government buying USD, selling RMB, and then trying to like avoid the consequences of like excessively printing yuan by like essentially like quarantining a lot of it from the market in a really weird way by putting mandates on the banks not to be able to, you know, they have to keep a certain storage of RMB, they're not allowed to do anything with it. Yeah, it's a really like crazy situation actually that went on for quite some time. I think really famously, Larry Summers from US Treasury, former US Treasury Treasurer, called it something like a balance of financial terror or something like that. You know, and there were some predictions that that was going to lead to some huge global financial crisis or something, given how unstable and how crazy actually that was. Instead, obviously, as we know, that's not what ultimately caused the sort of meltdown in 2008. Instead, it was the more, a different volatile aspect of neoliberalism with those sort of, that crazy configuration of like interlinked corporate assets. And I think it's worth just thinking about where we are, or how we got to where we are today in terms of how everybody dealt with that in this sort of bridging thing, I guess, between whatever neoliberalism was and then where we are today. You know, I think as we sort of kind of know, you know, it's not everyone's from Australia, but if you are from Australia, you know that it's constantly said, oh, the Chinese stimulus response to the global financial crisis in 2008 was what saved Australia or something like that. And I think it's worth just sort of going into that a little bit. I think China did deal with the threat to its economy from the global financial crisis with the stimulus program, in case you don't know, that prioritised debt-financed investment in property, factories, roads, other fixed assets, and this in turn created a debt bubble, which basically, I mean, the Chinese government refuses to let anything too volatile happen to the Chinese economy. So what you kind of, or actually also, or to let its stock market become too volatile. So what you kind of ended up with in the aftermath of the Chinese stimulus response to the global financial crisis is these huge companies, like zombie companies or whatever, kind of lumbering along, kind of spooked international investors who are too scared to do anything in the stock market because the Chinese government won't like let too much happen with it. And then obviously this kind of creates a risk of some kind of huge slowdown in the Chinese economy, which obviously they really don't want to happen. There's obviously a range of solutions that you could turn to deal with the threat of a slowdown, and I think one of the most interesting ones is obviously the idea of exporting capital, which is one of the ones that the Chinese government has embraced, for example, through the Belt and Road project. And this idea of like exporting capital to try and deal with some of the issues in the Chinese economy has really put China on a collision course with the United States, basically in this sort of competition for international markets. So I think, you know, we find ourselves now kind of in a really strange situation, I think, where the neoliberal consensus is, I don't know if it's totally over, but seems to be collapsing, I suppose. I think, you know, an interesting moment after the global financial crisis, Kevin Rudd, the former Australian Prime Minister, kind of warned, gave two warnings basically to, well, he said he was warning social democrats, but I think we would probably say he was more warning neoliberals. He really meant like post-Paul Keating Labor Party people, I guess. The first kind of warning that he gave was to basically said, as social democrats, neoliberals, he means we've got to save capitalism from itself, basically introduce modest regulation into these open markets that we've created and try to stop this a little bit. The second warning, he said, was not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So he's basically saying, don't succumb to temptations of, economic populism or something like that. But we obviously now look at the world and you can say, yeah, we have actually succumbed. We've got, the WTO, the IMF kind of warning of slowing growth. And you can see that this sort of like zero-sum thinking is sort of fashionable again. Got trade wars, currency wars, sort of national coalitions of capital, blah, 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 regional trade blocs and things like that. And I think really importantly, we've also got absolutely dominant corporate oligarchies that would stand in the way of any sort of redistributive project that might help rebalance the economies away from a kind of zero-sum into capitalist competition and in a different direction. There's actually a really good quote, I think, summarising this situation by Hong Kong sociologist Ho Fung Hung, who said, if it's capitalism's economic imperatives that bring us to the brink of war, its class rule characteristics then become the largest barrier to any alternative course of action. So I just wanted to sort of put that as a backdrop and then talk a bit about millennials. Sorry if it's a bit choppy.
2 minutes.
Oh, great, okay. I'll be really quick then. Too much background. I think there's some super common experiences that we could point to broadly for millennials in the developed West anyway. Maybe I'll just zoom through them. I think the things that everyone has in common, or all millennials have in common, low wages and low wage growth, alongside constant calls for wage restraint, actually, no matter what is happening in the economy. I think constantly increasing subsidies to abandon the public system, alongside maybe the public system more and more coming to resemble a kind of prison. The kind of undeniable fact that property wealth determines your prospects, everyone kind of knows that. I guess the normalisation of financial crises springing from speculation, maybe property market speculation specifically. Maybe a less directly experienced, but I think no less kind of determining factor would be the near illegality of any kind of industrial action. I think that's kind of important. And maybe, personally, I think maybe most importantly, but I don't know if everyone would agree with this, virtually no contemporary reforms, like redistributive reforms, that you could point to say that change is possible or anything could actually happen. Almost the opposite, actually, like a constant series of sellouts that you can point to go, okay, not much is possible. And I think beyond those kind of materially experienced things, I don't know if there's a huge ideological consensus, actually, among millennials about what neoliberalism is or anything like that, or how they experienced it. Maybe some kind of loose sense, cynical sense of something, I don't know. I'm going to have to really summarise the last bit. Well, anyway, I think that those experiences can maybe help, or those broad shared experiences can help us understand some of the limits maybe of the projects that have emerged in response to what's happened. I think that's kind of clear. I don't know if I have enough time to go into it, but I think you pointed to the New Zealand experience of neoliberalism. I do think the US is the most useful one, example to point to in terms of millennials' engagement with redistributive projects. That we can point to sort of say what are the limits of these. Maybe I'll just do a quick version rather than from notes, but I think that there's sort of two things that people point to. Obviously the MAGA on the one hand, which I don't think is a redistributive project, but I know there's a temptation to read that into it. Maybe the kind of bad faith kind of Steve Bannon promotion of MAGA as like a redistributive project at its heart. I definitely don't buy that. And then obviously the Democratic Socialist, or social democratic, maybe we would say more accurately, kind of response on the left, which I'll just do a quick summary of what I think about that maybe, and then we can talk about it more in the discussion. But I do think there's something there that is interesting. Whatever you think of the politics of the kind of DSA, Bernie Sanders, Zoran Mandani kind of thing, the potential of it and the real momentum created by that, I think we can't ignore as maybe the strongest kind of millennial response to what's happening, or what has happened under neoliberalism and what's happening now in the shift towards a kind of more economic populist thing. I mean, you've got, for example, rise of public support for unions in the US, you've got rise of new union ballots in the US, actually a super high success rate for those union ballots. I think it's like over 80%, something like that. And to be sort of blunt about it, like you've got actual money changing hands from bosses to workers in a modest sense. I'm not trying to overstate how influential it is, but you've got at least hints that could cut into the cynicism maybe of millennials that something is actually doable about the kind of broader situation that we find ourselves in today. I mean, I think it's an interesting example to look actually at Seattle, where you had a socialist, not a social democrat actually, like an actual socialist, on the Seattle City Council for like 10 years, sort of interacting with and bouncing off the Bernie Sanders kind of momentum that was created throughout that period. And in that sort of 10-year period that she was on the council, you know, actively organising people around those sort of social democratic demands and bouncing off that real momentum that was created, billions of dollars actually was transferred from bosses to workers. That wasn't replicated all over the US, but I do think that the example does sort of point to the real and maybe first redistributive success of millennial response to what has happened in neoliberalism and what's happening now as we move towards whatever it is we're moving towards. I had to do an abridged version of that, but I might just leave it there and then we can, yeah, sorry about that.
Thank you, Chris. Now we'll move on to Guy Rundle.
Can you give me a 5-minute warning as well as the 2?
Sure.
Cheers. All right, so I was asked to do this from the perspective of Gen X, the most unloved generation. Yep. Is that better? Okay. Yeah, so I've done it largely as a historical thing, and I've tried to avoid retrospect to try and talk about how we were perceiving the changes at the time, what was happening, or from one perspective anyway, what sort of things became visible and what didn't, that sort of thing. And I've overwritten too, so I'll try and speed through the first bit. So basically, Gen X comes of age about late 70s to mid 80s, and that coincides with the real collapse of the Western left. So you have a stagnant economy in the late 70s, and then you have a whole beginnings of offshoring of industry, steady decline of working class power in that respect, and a whole lot of events really the departure of any democratic socialist spirit from Labour or social democratic parties. You have the collapse of European leftism into Red Terror, that sort of thing. The revelations about the Khmer Rouge really destroy any notion of third worldist independent paths, that sort of thing. And so you have an increasing transfer of youth energies from politics, from raw politics, or class politics to culture, and that's why you get things like the punk revolution and that sort of thing, and the rise of the subcultures, you know, youth subcultures, the goths and that sort of thing. You get, and it's that sort of vacuum, the vacuum is the event, and then after that you get Thatcher and Reagan being elected into that vacuum because there's really no alternative. Then, even then, in the first part of the 80s, there's still a thought on the left that this is a blip, that this reaction will then create a rallying point, which was certainly plausible given the mass unemployment under Thatcher and that sort of thing, and Mitterrand's election and the sort of Dirigist-style socialism he briefly tried, a couple of things like that, but that pretty much ended in 1984-85. Thatcher's re-elected, Reagan is re-elected, and then in 85, what seems to be the key final event is the defeat of the UK miners' strike. That really sort of, it not only demoralises and dissipates the working class left in the UK, it does it globally. In Australia, what you've obviously got is the Hawke government coming into power and doing these things from the Labor side, not nearly as starkly as in New Zealand, more a sort of mix of neoliberal and social market sort of things, and that changed the politics here substantially. So what you really get by around 85, 86 is really a disappearance of left politics. People, younger people, find it hard to believe, but really the terms capitalism and socialism in the mainstream just disappeared. Nobody used those words except on the fringes. There wasn't that debate at all, and what remained of the mainstream left just became a loyal opposition to this process of modernisation, which wasn't yet full neoliberalism, it would seem to me. And what you're getting is a transformation as industry is further dismantled, offshored, that sort of thing, and as information, leisure and other industries start to fill out the economy, you get a shift from class reproduction of social life, a fairly tightly bounded working class, neighbourhoods, unions, intergenerational jobs, and that sort of thing, and the formation of that, and the middle class in terms of the professions, the private schools and that sort of thing. A world in which culture is largely on the outside. You know, you've got 4 TV channels, you go to a movie occasionally, that sort of thing. It's very much an externality. And over those 10 years, culture rushes in as the major or a major process of self-formation and of group formation and collective identity. And as the real prospect of a political class, political imaginary recedes, you get political struggle being substantially cultural in that way. What political economic struggle remains becomes largely instrumental. So that's where you get, as I say, these large struggles. The social movements have risen, the women's movements, black movement, gay and lesbian liberation, that sort of thing. So you have these big fights that seem ridiculous now. You know, I don't know. You know, Madonna, you know, had a video for a song "Papa Don't Preach," which has a priest, you know, sort of snogging a woman, that sort of thing. The debate about that went on for weeks, you know, tried to be banned, that sort of thing. All this sort of stuff, you know, it sounds absurd, but it was real because what you had was a struggle between what remained of the old traditional authorities, the churches, and that sort of thing, and a new world based around culture. The left fragments totally, the official communist movement becomes moribund and split. Trotskyist groups who had some purchase in some sections of the working class largely lose that and become student and youth movements and become increasingly rigid. Social movements fill the gap, the environment movement, the anti-nuclear movement, and that sort of thing, and become huge. And then the other part of the left starts the long march through the institutions. So people who were fire-breathing radicals in the 70s get law degrees, go into government and start changing things through, you know, anti-discrimination laws and that sort of thing. And the effect of that, obviously, whatever good things it does, is to reaffirm the base of the system. It legitimises the base of the system by saying, let's make it less worse through superstructural means. Now, it's also worth remembering that the USSR still exists at the time. Now, nobody much believes in it as anything, but it's there as an other to capitalism, as China is starting to go on another road. And nobody really believes that it's going, you know, nobody really believes it's going to disappear within 6 years. That nobody thought that. Everybody thought it would just be there indefinitely. It would change its form internally, whatever. But that we were in this large sort of stasis. So as this goes on, the other thing you get within the theoretical framework is as you're getting more and more people becoming art students, expansion of the universities and that sort of thing, theoretical interest is changing from Marxism over to post-structuralism. Baudrillard and Lyotard and people like that who map really what this world of images and symbols and that sort of thing, which totally dominate, is like, and then following them, Foucault and Derrida, and those really substantially supplant Marxism, you know, so all the Marxist reading groups of the 70s where people are struggling through Capital Volume 2, they all go and everybody is struggling through Foucault's History of Sexuality, which is a lot more fun. Now, what's important to understand, I think, here is that the Baudrillard stuff and all that may seem wacky from a retrospective, but what people were trying to do was really work out what was happening in terms of the change relationship between the object world, the world of real political economy, and the world of images, and the change in the way that people were being constructed, and that sort of thing. And that really carries through the 80s as a great split, as the economy is neoliberalising, as institutions being neoliberalised, as markets being implanted into hospital systems, university systems, that sort of thing. You're not getting an ability for that to be bodied forth in a lot of the politics, because so much of people doing that left sort of institutional politics are institutional and reformist, and largely going over to that. And then, of course, and so what becomes dominant is theoretically and strategically, is things like Clausenluft's post-Marxism and that sort of thing, influenced by Foucault. So an abandonment of the base superstructure notion of determination, but substituting this post-structuralist notion of infinite points of determination in the social whole. And then what you really get is, as I said, what nobody really expected. The Eastern Bloc dissipates, well, you could see how that could happen, but then the USSR dissolves in a weekend, and that is really an epochal transformation. As I said, it's a dead letter, but it's nevertheless a time now when capitalism has no big other. No, absolutely no big other. And of course, that's when you get the period that was known as globalization then, and I guess mature neoliberalism now, where the West then just, without the Cold War needs for an emphasis on national security or national control of economic processes, can just open up the borders and complete the Bretton Woods process of creating a World Trade Organization, which was on hold for 40 years, and create this global form. And that in turn is then creating the further transformation of the life world, if you like. You know, the degree to which everyday life is marketized, commodified, that sort of thing, was still something that couldn't be imagined in the 80s, and certainly not in the 70s by most people. The very textures of life just being turned into markets in every social institution. And so you get a rallying point then really with the Zapatistas in '94, who use the internet, which is, you know, being further transforming things. So they use the internet to make their local struggle in Chiapas a global one. So I think they do their uprising on the day the WTO the GATT agreement is signed, which creates the WTO, and that folds over into Europe and that sort of thing. And then you start to get what we call the global anti-capitalist movement, which is then capable of thematising the material politics of global capitalism once again. As Naomi Klein said, you know, this arose for a lot of people from the cultural politics. Like, if you'd spent years trying to work out what these advertisements were doing to you as a subject, you then started eventually to ask what it was doing to the people who made the products being advertised. And so that's when you get this thing. Now, what's important about this is that this is both a victory and a defeat for a movement which is proposing real alternative, because the only way in which the global anti-capitalist movement manages to rise out of the sectarianism and arid intellectual debates which characterised a lot of the 80s and 90s was to have a sort of agreement about organising separately but striking together, but with a much larger, broader spectrum of beliefs than you would have otherwise had. So there's no debating about a common program. You've got in Seattle or Melbourne or whatever, you've got anarchist primitivists, you know, working with Marxists, working with Labour leftists, working with social movement people, all doing different things, but all capable of working together. But the price of that, of course, is that the program has to be purely negative. So the slogan of the global anti-capitalist movement was, another world is possible. It doesn't say what that world was. All it says is, you know, the present is shit. It just negates the present. And that was completely necessary. That was the only way we got past both the sectarianism that had bedeviled the early period and also the problem with emergent identity politics. In the 80s and 90s, you have this problem where the justifiable surging up of issues around gender and sex and identity and all this started to dominate meetings to such a degree that the micropolitics of meetings became politics itself, and you have this sort of thing. So that's what you you're doing. And I said I'd go up to 1998, so that's what we got to in 1998, and then you obviously have 9/11 comes in, and the war in Iraq, and that resets politics again in a certain way. Then the 2008 crash. Then you have Occupy, and Occupy really is an even more tepid version of the global anti-capitalist movement. So instead of another world as possible, it just said no. I think that was it. You know, it's even more retreated to a sort of social democratic, let's not burn the planet and kill everybody sort of thing. And then you get, you know, the revival of a programmatic socialism. So what I'd just like to, so I'm just trying to emphasise, I guess, in that the degree of neoliberalism we have now, the degree of marketisation in which technology has combined with like, you know, dating apps, gig economies in every sort of job and that sort of thing, was still not imaginable in the 80s and 90s. I think it's fair to say that we did not think that this would happen, anything like this. If anything, the imagination of technology, whether good or bad, was that it would still be statist and large scale and that sort of thing, you know, the information superhighway and that sort of thing. So that long trajectory of the neoliberal transformation of everyday life, which I think is something more than neoliberalism going on, was just something that couldn't be brought into the present at the time. And if there's a strategic lesson from that, it's probably to be more willing to imagine the worst in the present about the near future. I'll leave it there.
Good. Thank you very much, Guy. Next up we have Ryan Nicola from Panelists, please.
Thanks. My first political experience was in 1998. I had just started high school in Fremantle overlooking the ports. In April of that year, the port operator, Patrick Stevedores, sacked its entire unionised workforce in collaboration with the new Conservative Howard government, sending thousands of wharfies out into the streets. We watched as police forces smashed through picket lines, pushing the beleaguered trade union movement to its limits. And although the wharfies would find some victories, there was a sense that the struggle was over before it began. You could see it on their faces. As Tony Soprano would say, I get the feeling I came in at the end. For my generation, the Millennials, the end was that of neoliberalism and the 20th century that birthed it. The 90s seemed like the last optimistic decade of GoldenEye 64, of the X-Files, of the Sydney Olympics and of the Indigenous reconciliation movement. For the young Millennials and our parents' generation, that optimism ended abruptly on September 11, 2001. As the war on terror ramped up, we were pulled into what seemed like a new politics for us, the anti-war demonstration. No war for oil was the favourite slogan of many. But also emerged was the concept of anti-imperialism, hinting at a revival of an older political consciousness. David Harvey, in his 2004 book, The New Imperialism, signalled the changing of the guard of the economic and political orders. Quote, the economic collapse that began in the high-tech dot-com economy of 1999 soon spread to reveal that much of what passed for finance capital was in fact unredeemable fictitious capital, supported by scandalous accounting practices and totally empty assets. Before the events of 9/11, it was clear that neoliberal imperialism was weakening on the inside, and that the days of neoliberalism and its specific forms of imperialism were numbered, end quote. As the anti-Civil War unrest failed to cohere into something persistent, it became clearer that the previous generation had left us no credible institutions for political and social action, other than perhaps an outstripped academia with its deepening disconnect from civil society, and the demoralised trade union movement. In 2007, the technocratic Mandarin-speaking Kevin Rudd replaced Howard, promising anti-austerity. Also that year, Barack Obama was running for president, revitalizing the 90s dream of a post-racial utopia, a society of enlightened liberal discussion and debate, of bipartisanship, the Green New Deal, and the scaling back of the American empire through only the undesirable but necessary noble wars. Both Obama and Rudd positioned themselves as the first post-neoliberal world leaders. Also that year, Naomi Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine, became a bestseller and proposed the political concept of socialization, nationalization, worker solidarity were shocked out of the way at key political junctures, rather than, quote, defeated in a great battle of ideas or voted down in elections. This was for Klein the dirty secret of the neoliberal era. But was this really the case? And as Guy said, Reagan, Thatcher, Clinton, Blair, and John Howard were all re-elected quite handily. What was neoliberalism? For the millennials following Klein, it was the call for anti-neoliberalism. We were told that it fell to us to defend the gains of the 20th century, the welfare state, the union, the academy, and what was left of the environment, from the undemocratic neoliberal shock therapy, and defend them we did. The collapse of Lehman Brothers signaled the beginning of the global financial crisis, and we were thrown into uncertainty once again. The crisis threw mud over the whole order, Obama most significantly. Within the first year of his presidency, opinion of him on the left had dropped dramatically, and with it, our hopes of a gentle-faced anti-neoliberalism. This drove us to search for a new theory for a new moment. Mark Fisher's 2009 text, Capitalist Realism, was a hit with the millennials. He wrote that, quote, after the bank bailouts, neoliberalism has, in every sense, been discredited. That is not to say that neoliberalism has disappeared overnight. On the contrary, its assumptions continue to dominate political economy. But they do so now no longer as part of an ideological project that has confident forward momentum, but is as inertial, undead defaults. Fisher's writing captured the frustration that millennials had experienced trying to carry on the anti-neoliberalism of the previous generation, who are now seeing their hopes dashed with the tumbling fortunes of the anti-austerity leaders and movements. These leaders seemed only to be able to replicate or master the neoliberal state. There was a sense that the GFC had been a missed opportunity for the left, and it seemed like Klein's hypothesis had been validated. However, Fisher instilled a vague sense of optimism, quote, but even if it is now evident that the credit crisis will not lead to the end of capitalism all by itself, the crisis has led to a relaxing of a certain kind of mental paralysis. It is year zero again, and a space has been cleared for a new anti-capitalism to emerge, which is not necessarily tied to the old language of traditions. So again, what was neoliberalism? Well, for Mark Fisher, one could say that it was an inherited political paralysis, a pathology of the left, as he interestingly put it. One that might be overcome in and through a careful consideration of the unfolding fallout of the GFC. The following few years were flooded with ideas. Slavoj Žižek's neo-Lacanianism, Lars Lee's neo-Kautskyism, David Graeber's neo-Prudonism, Fisher's neo-accelerationism, all grappled in some way with the now decade-long political crisis of neoliberalism, each invoking its own historical current of socialist thought, mediated by the New Left, and each capturing a section of the Millennial Left. It was a moment. These new theories were put to the test in perhaps the first global reverberation of the GFC, the Occupy movement circa 2011, capturing the rage that the financial overlords had got away with it. In 2011, Zizek said of the Occupy movement, quote, what it reminds us of is the fact that the 20th century is over. Not only state socialism and the social democratic welfare state, but also the deepest hope of the utopian left, quote, horizontal organization, direct democracy, all this, I don't think it works, end quote. This spirit sanctioned a move on from the call to defend the 20th century and opened the imagination to what genuinely could be a post-neoliberal left and what it could look like. This crucible of crisis, theory, and frustration was perhaps the high point for the millennials. I moved to Boston in early 2013 and found Jacobin magazine being circulated amongst the leftists. In its pages, we read about international phenomena, Podemos, Brexit, Syriza, Corbyn. Something was in the air, political possibility. This moment catapulted a little-known Democratic Socialist senator from Vermont into popularity. Was Bernie what we'd been looking for? There was a hesitancy amongst putting our lot in with the Democrats, who, under Obama, were now more than ever the managers of the neoliberal state. In April 2015, Bhaskar Sunkara, the founder and editor of Jacobin, wrote in a headline article, "Bernie for President," that, quote, "clearly it won't be enough to win this time, but seen as an opportunity for movement building. Sanders' candidacy could strengthen the left in the long run. Our goal must be to transcend the Democratic Party entirely," end quote. But even since 2012, Sunkara had been telling millennial socialists to vote Democrat. Sanders' New Dealism was perhaps a step backward to our earlier anti-neoliberalism. Maybe a child of the original New Deal could get it right. Simultaneously, with the rise of a populist anti-globalist right, the Millennial Left were also being drawn back into a series of social movementism, #MeToo and BLM, guided by the Democrats. This inflamed tensions along the lines of identity politics, moral panics, class reductionism, etc. The rise of Trump alongside Bernie was perhaps a more dramatic expression of the crisis of neoliberalism. Early in the process, Australian intellectual Dite noted that, quote, "On the left, there has been a schizophrenic reaction, with Trump alternately being treated as a joke or the most dangerous reactionary candidate of all time," end quote. Dite perfectly captured the left's political misrecognition, a sign that we were about to be caught out by the changes taking place. Chris Catrone, the founder of Platypus, writes, quote, "The problem for the left is that its hysterics are less about society than about itself. The left cries a foul when mainstream politics steals its thunder, when change happens from the right rather than through the left's own revolutionary politics," end quote. In early 2017, after Trump's election, I joined the Democratic Socialists of America, as did many of my fellow Bernie bros. There was a brief moment at the start of that year where the original ideas of the Millennial Left movement found a new airing, socialism and the political independence from the Democrats. There was even a whisper that now was the perfect time to start a new party. Well, shortly, it was all P-Tate, Ukraine, dossiers, Comey, Russia, etc. By March of that year, with everyone's head still spinning, the memory of 2008 to 2015 was pushed aside, along with the rest of history, and every effort was now being directed into, quote, saving democracy from fascism. The millennials were now the last defenders of neoliberalism against Trump. As Cutrone writes in 2016's Why Not Trump, quote, "Finding Trump acceptable is not outrageous. But the outrageous anti-Trumpism, the relentless spinning and lying of the status quo defending itself, is actually not acceptable, not if any political change whatsoever is desired." By early 2018, it was all forgotten. The goal was now to elect better socialist Democrats, and the squad was born. Trump really is the first post-neoliberal president. He was doing everything that we wanted Obama to do, politically that is, not in policy. He transformed the grand old party into his party, splitting and realigning. He used the bully pulpit to whip them all into line. He threw away the shackles of bipartisanship, of decorum, of expertise, and acted with a keen political instinct. He was the voice of the people, who he channeled directly, unmediated by any outdated party, and was thus decried as a populist because it made him invincible. He wrestled with the entrenched bureaucracy and called out the deep state by name. Cutrone wrote in The Millennial Left is Dead that, quote, "All of us must play the hand that history has dealt us. The problem is that the Millennial Left chose not to play its own hand, shying away in fear from the gamble. Instead, they fell back onto the past, trying to replay the cards dealt to previous generations. They are inevitably suffering the same results of those past failed wages," end quote. What was neoliberalism? For the millennials, it was the missed opportunity, the crisis of capitalist politics that bent us to its will rather than the other way around. Thanks.
Thank you, Ryan. So now we'll move on to panellist responses. So you've got sort of 5 to 7 minutes to respond to the other panellists, and we will respond in the same order that the speaking occurred. So I'll pass it over straight to you.
I know. Wow, there's quite a lot to respond to, but I'm not going to. I just was actually making some points and so on here. I mean, from my perspective as a member of Generation X, we're the generation and so on, they essentially missed out on a lot of these things and stuck between millennials and the baby boomers. The one thing I remember distinctly about neoliberalism was it cost me my job. It cost me my job and so on as a Watties worker. It cost my friends their jobs, and it cost people their houses. And when I finally went to university in late 80s, because what he sent me there, they had to basically place 180 workers and so on, and I had a university entrance. It forced me to pay fees. And as I said, that's what I remember most about neoliberalism and so on a personal regard. But, I mean, just talking about neoliberalism as a whole, one of the things that I was always interested in neoliberalism is it's a restatement really of some very old individual philosophies that up until the last 30 years had actually been disregarded as a whole. Because when you think about it, in the 19th century, there was a movement, a revolt one could actually say, to actually ensure that workers got their fair share. Things improved. There was factory reforms, there was greater increase in democracy, there was the belief that in fact workers themselves could actually control their society and have a stake in that society and so on too. And in fact, the Liberals picked up on this, and T.H. Green, the Liberal philosopher, actually said that in fact for individuals, he said, to actually achieve their full individuality, it meant that some individuals had to actually be disadvantaged. And by what he meant by that was some people, rich people, had to pay tax. And as a result of paying tax, it meant that some social provisions could be made, i.e., essentially education could be paid for, or healthcare or something like that, which actually advantaged working class people. And that was the philosophy and so on, I think, behind the collective response and so on of the union movement, the socialist movement, the liberal movement, that went all the way through until the mid-20th century or the early 20th century, the collective belief. And after that, of course, it changed. The return of previous individualistic rights, that you could only be free to the free market, that the individual was what mattered the most. And that is the crunch, the kernel of neoliberalism. And that when you think of it, in the 1960s, for example, when I was born, there was in New Zealand essentially a consensus. Yes, a social democratic consensus, but a consensus nonetheless that a collective response was needed. And there was this man called Mr. Enemy, who I thought was quite an apt name actually, but he led the Country Party. And Mr. Enemy's entire philosophy was based around what we would now know as neoliberalism. And he was ridiculed in the New Zealand Parliament. Even the National Party called him a loon. But yet those ideas have now become commonplace. The idea of the market, of the freedom of the individual and so on like that. That individuals are only free if they themselves get exactly what they actually want, and that can only be achieved through the free market. Okay, and that is really the kernel and so on of this philosophy and so on here. And to my mind too, that when you think about it, the populism of Donald Trump and so on like that is the end point of this ridiculous, shameful, philosophical and economic facade that we've had imposed upon us for the past 50 years. People no longer feel that they have a stake in society, and so they turn to people that they think will listen to them, but they don't listen to them. But that's where Trump comes in. They feel that somehow or other he will resolve these problems, and people like him and so on will essentially make society better. In reality, I think that the left needs to actually retain or regain its belief and its faith in common people. We have to start listening to common people. We have to basically do the things and so on that the left was bought, or socialists were originally created for. And that means giving people a greater stake in society as a whole. And I think that is the problem. And as for the standard social democratic left, I think that, what can I say? But I mean, the thing is that there has been a hegemony created here. A hegemony that essentially has cemented neoliberalism as the main forethought, the go-to in modern society. And we have a political spectrum that we believe in standard social democratic principles like free healthcare, education, progressive taxes, as seen as being dangerously communist. there is something very wrong with society. Something very wrong. And that's what I've got to say.
Yeah, I didn't realise we were supposed to respond to it like everybody, but okay. Yeah, actually, I think that's a really good point about like lived experience being the most kind of like seminal thing in people's mind. I think that is absolutely true. I don't know, I would have a question about, like, I think we can look back on certain periods and say, like, you know, this writer was very popular at the time, or this writer was very popular. I don't know, I think maybe that's like overinflated or something. I'm not sure that is as influential on any sort of like shared ideological thing that people might have. I think the kind of real life stuff is maybe more influential in that sense. And then the books come
False dichotomy, isn't it?
It is, yeah, totally. It is fake. Like, obviously they interplay with each other. I don't know, I just think if we're thinking like broadly about a generation, which is also a bit fake, like how do you, you know, how do you do it? But yeah, anyway, that was something. I totally take the point about the limitations of the social democratic left. Nobody thinks it's perfect or good, actually. And I hope I didn't imply that I think it's the vehicle for change or something like that. I absolutely don't think that. But what I do think that kind of Sanders push managed to do in a way that nothing else in my life has ever been able to do is normalise just the word socialism, normalise redistributional struggles as something that might actually be able to do something, and just mainstream it in a way that no book really ever could. And not because Sanders is a genius, actually, he's kind of quite basic, really, in some ways. But because so many, I mean, hundreds of thousands of people mobilised in some way around the campaign, and since then have mobilised in various other ways, not just electorally, but unfortunately that's often the direction that it kind of gets pushed in. And I think that's what's mainstreamed it. And that's super positive. When I first encountered the left, people really thought you were crazy if you mentioned socialism. Like, genuinely, people were like, seems a bit weird or lame or something. And it's been mainstreamed in a way that, I mean, you were talking about this guy about changing norms and so on. And I think that's just been the seismic shift that has happened in society, the normalisation of socialism again through this imperfect vehicle, absolutely. But then within that momentum that's in the US, I think there are like glimmers here and there of more potential for it. But obviously, yeah, heaps of limitations. Forgot what else I was going to say. I'll leave it there.
Let me just use this as someone. The period we're calling neoliberalism, the return of the right, whatever, from the late 70s onwards, early 80s onwards, I think it's not useful to go to a false consciousness or a foisted or that sort of explanation first. The first important explanation is, why did the previous politics fail in such a way as to create a vacuum where these new politics of the right could seem to a large group of people across the working and middle classes to be a liberation, to be a better life. And two things happened here. First, as I've emphasised, the form of social life was changing rapidly. So there was a fit between post-war social democracy and the rather limited worlds of class life, the collective form of working class life, the mirroring collective form of middle class life in the professions, and that sort of thing. People had very low expectations, relatively speaking, about the degree of individuality trajectories in their lives. You went to school, you went to the factory or the office, you joined the tennis club, you married someone at the tennis club, you lived, in the same suburb, everybody watched Homicide on TV. These were the collectivism was structural in that point, and that was what made class possible. Now, as that changed through the Keynesian revolution, as consumerism, as new media, that sort of thing came in, that has a fracturing effect on social reproduction and the production of subjectivity. And that's doubled when you start to demolish the industrial base and send it to the third world and start to fill the new employment factors with tertiary trained people whose very means of being reproduced as workers is to individualise them, is to train them to make decisions, to think differently, that sort of thing. So what happened in the late 70s and early 80s is this class life which underpinned a social democracy or a democratic socialist urge starts to look incredibly boring. It starts to look incredibly dull. It starts to look like a limit at the same time as the mechanisms of social democracy are rusting up. You know, it started from really social democracy post-war is a rollover of the state technologies developed for the Second World War, for total war. You created these vast bureaucracies with enormous power, and when the war's over, you roll them over into social democratic modernisation. And you can get away with that in the 50s and 60s and that sort of thing, because people are happy, they're getting better lives, sort of thing. They don't have a great demand for individuality. And then you hit the 70s, and that's where the contradictions occur. That people want more from their lives, they want different things. They are already individualised, so you cannot simply restore that form of collectivism anymore. And that's where you get the material differences that makes Thatcherism and those sorts of things possible, is the differential rewards that go to different sections of the working class, which is to say a certain strata of the working class become more prosperous in the UK, they get to buy their public housing, their council houses and that sort of thing. In Australia you start to get negative gearing and all these things in the property and that sort of thing. So one section of the working class becomes asset rich in a way they never were. Working class people owned a house in the 30s or 40s or 50s. It was a cottage. It was a little terrace, that sort of thing. It had no fungible value. It wasn't going to go up in value, that sort of thing. You have this division, which has now been going on for decades, in which it is in the working interest of a significant section of the working class to vote for a right-wing economic agenda, and that's the material basis. And it's in the cultural interest of people to have a world which has a lot of TV channels, a lot of movies, because, you know, as we know, today's desires are tomorrow's needs. As you socially reconstruct, culturally reconstruct people so they can be part of an information, knowledge and culture economy, those needs become as basic as food or shelter or that sort of thing. You know, if I made everybody here go back to 4 TV channels, you'd all go mad. You know, it would not be tolerable in that way. You create this different thing. So that's what's going on there. So that's really these deep structural movements in the nature of capitalism, technology and social organisation that make an older form of social democracy, certainly, and probably anything resembling socialism, pretty much impossible in that way. It's not going to be revived in that way. The way in which it's revived is obviously that there's now a class war, or a formation war, if you like, between the residual working class, large sections of those in cultural terms, and what we could already call the intellectually trained or the knowledge class or that sort of thing. But now, numerically substantial group of people who are tertiary trained, either in science and technology and culture, who have a different type of subjectivity. So where Marxists projected onto the working class the idea that intellectuals had of communism, of free flow and that sort of thing, working classes are really national working classes. And in the great divide between the working class and the middle class on that side, and the intellectually trained and the knowledge class, that side is cosmopolitan, open borders, interested in the new and that sort of thing, and the other side is interested in the regular, the known, and that sort of thing, and that lies at the base of the success of the right since 2008. The left did not offer the working class and selected middle classes the world they wanted, and the right did. The right said, we will shore up the fading base of your life world with tariffs, action on immigration. Now, whether they're delivering or not is another question, and what will happen if they don't deliver is a further question. But that's where the right won and the left lost. And the tragedy of the left might be that the left is so based among the intellectually trained that it can't offer those things. You can't persuade every DSA organiser to go out and be, even if you decided you were going to say, let's cap immigration, let's build a wall, let's build a DSA wall on the Mexican border, that sort of thing, let's make this a place for the national working class, it wouldn't be possible for those people here to affirm it, because the deepest political ethic that drives people here to be this sort of, in this sort of politics, is that of universal humanism and universal citizenship. So that is a deep contradiction that really takes you beyond class politics.
Thank you, everyone. Quentin, the first thing that came to mind when you started speaking was at the end of her life, Margaret Thatcher had this interview, and she was asked what her greatest achievement of her life was, and she said, New Labour.
Yeah.
And she said, we forced our opponents to change. And in some sense, that was the experience for a lot of both the Australian left as well. That I think Elizabeth Humphreys has this book called How Labour Built Neoliberalism. Platypus hosted a panel a few years ago here where we had Max Ogden on, who was a member of the Communist Party of Australia and an AMW's shop steward for most of his life. And he was talking about the sort of preconditions for the Accord in Australia in the mid-80s, was that during the 70s, the trade union movement had essentially become ossified into what he called money militancy, meaning that the trade union movement had sort of peeled back from their kind of larger demands and were just all their struggles were about wages. And there was a frustration that they couldn't really get the workers in a lot of their, especially the Communist Party influenced unions, to raise the level of their struggle beyond the wage demand. And they participated, the Communist Party participated with Labour in the shaping of the Accord in order to free up the labour movement from the wage struggle so that it could engage in some sort of broader struggle in society. I hope I cited him there. But that's an interesting element that I think Guy said there, that neoliberalism was the return of the right, or the new right. In some sense, the left played as fundamental a role in the creation of neoliberalism as so-called right figures as well. So I think you captured that quite well. Chris, you mentioned some of these, the American socialists like Osama Sawant and now Mamdani, for example. I also participated in the Bernie 2020 campaign. I ran at the Melbourne version of it. And there was a sense already in 2018 that there was sort of diminishing returns. That with AOC's campaign, even though she was elected, even by 2019 there was massive disappointment in that. I came to the belief that had Bernie been elected in 2017, that would have been the biggest catastrophe for the Millennial Left. That would have meant we would have now become sort of the stewards of the American state and global imperialist power, quote unquote. That nothing could have disorganized us more than that. Yeah. And so that also will happen if someone starts, flirting with power of the New York City municipal control. That the Millennial Left is not really in any sort of position to sort of speak for society, but rather it hopes that it can get a good citizen in that can sort of single-handedly grapple with state power and thus can wield it in some way. And I think without a broader social influence of the left, that will just ultimately fail. Lastly, Guy, you talked about things like Chantal Mouffe and Leclerc. And maybe this is prompted by something Chris said, that the idea of generations in the left, that maybe this is a complicating figure. Platypus uses the sort of thought figures of the new left of the 60s and 70s and then the 80s and 90s, particularly because they were engagement with Marxism, and particularly the character that I think the Guy summarized as well is there was kind of rejection of Marxism, or like not just like a Stalinophobia, but a Marxophobia in certain ways, that it was rejected, but nevertheless it was received. People who were reading Leclerc and Mouffe were also reading Marx, and they were thinking about it. But it left us, when the millennials came onto the scene, I remember in the sort of anti-war protests, the Gen Xers were having these very bizarre conferences that the sort of a trope, they were called like bodies, places, spaces, new interventions and radical discourses for the moment. And they were just, non-understandable. You couldn't really understand the discourse. But two, they were just very blatantly apolitical. Like, there was not really a call for a kind of political intervention. And that's where I mentioned something like David Harvey coming in, where there was sort of the millennials began to sort of start encountering kind of Marxist history through the categories of like imperialism and fictitious capital that didn't really register till the GFC. But that was kind of the millennials began an engagement with Marxism, and that's why they were in some sense a left. Maybe I'll stop there.
Could I just...
Please.
Yeah. Just a couple of comments on that. One of the interesting things that in that passage to the Accord, one of the crucial things in Australia was the campaign for the 35-hour week that was pushed by Laurie Carmichael from the metal workers, and this was the idea, of course, 40 hours wages for a 35-hour week, and it was in that sense a radical, modestly radical way of trying to reorient from the wage nexus. It was trying to say free time, more free time, that sort of thing. Now, it was defeated, and it was largely defeated because there was no substantial support for it among the rank and file. There was among some of the more radical unions, which had some sort of Marxist layers in them, but by and large, people didn't want it. Now, I think the specialist research question is, did people not want it because actually people needed overtime? And they were all working 48-hour, 52-hour weeks de facto in order to pay for the things they need? Or was it just not something that could be drawn into the imaginary? But in any case, that seems to me to be a signal moment in Australia. Just the second thing was, you're right about the bodies, places, spaces sort of stuff. By the 2000s, that had become a dead letter, But as I say, when that was starting in the 80s, that is about a sort of praxis where you're trying to work out what's happening. You've got this society which very rapidly has an onslaught of images, 24-hour TV, advertising, that sort of thing, and also technological changes. IVF came in. That changes the relation of technology to the human body in fairly substantial ways. So, sex, the beginnings of the separation of sex and gender, all those things had to be worked out in some way because you couldn't just continue with the Marxist structural politics of the economy because it was a dead letter. It was just, there seemed no way of intervention, there seemed no working class radical formation of any size. So there's no point continuing to read Capital Volume 2. It becomes, it just becomes scholastic. And that was, so the response was political. It was to try and work out what the fuck was going on.
Cool, thank you very much. So now we're going to move on to a Q&A section. So just to reiterate, if we could keep the questions quite short and pointed and to articulate them towards a panellist in particular, if you felt that they needed to be answered. So I'll just pass the microphone out and we use them. Yeah, please. I think that's the idea.
I'll go with you first.
Okay. So, Guy, you sort of touched on what I would almost describe as a crisis of bourgeois subjectivity, where in the 70s people moved away from engaging in politics into engaging in mass consumer culture. A decade earlier, Adorno noticed a similar crisis, which he sort of called actionism, where the left moved away from any kind of theoretical discussion and moved completely into just like what we now know as protest politics. There was a similar sort of crisis in theory during the Second International, where Marxism went through a crisis with the sort of rise of revisionism and then later Stalinism, and with that sort of led to a collapse of Marxism and rise of fascism and everything after that. So in both cases, where the left did not have a sort of any kind of theory, the right came and replaced it. So to what extent is neoliberalism a reflection of a crisis in leftist theory?
I think it's more that I'd always emphasise the crisis of the the structural forms of what was going on, and then an inability to answer that. In Marxism in the late 60s and that sort of thing, there had been enormous debates about the nature of class and structure, and this is Delancey, Castoriadis, that sort of thing. And that had a real strategic connection because, on the one hand, one side of that debate says the working class is only 6 steel workers in Athens, and then on the other side they say it's everybody who earns a wage. And that's a real question as to who you organise and that sort of thing. Now, all that sort of stuff and a lot of the economic debate about transition to socialism, about the value form, the debates between Marx and the Neo-Ricardians and that sort of thing, went on furiously for 10 years, but it all sort of dissipated. The left didn't collapse in the late 70s because the theory dissipated. The theory dissipated because the left collapsed. And suddenly, debating the value form of capitalism just seemed absolutely pointless. What was it being debated for? Nothing was on the horizon. This had all been debated in terms of how would you make a socialist transition in a capitalist economy. And so I really do think it's the structural forms. The crisis of bourgeois subjectivity was really that via consumerism, what had previously been forms of bourgeois and bohemian subjectivity were extended to the whole population, So everybody got to fashion themselves through art, music, rock, all that, and wanted to, fairly obviously.
Thank you. So this has all been about a retrospective on neoliberalism, trying to understand it looking backwards, and then what comes after. But I guess my question is, if we understand neoliberalism as essentially being about the market is in control, privatized state assets, that ideology, I mean, it's been pointed to that Trump has put in a lot of things that are, against neoliberalism, tariffs, protectionism, and rhetorically has been against that. We want to bring back jobs from overseas. But if you actually look, he's now in his second term. He had his first term. That's not really, it's only the second term where he's really gone crazy with the tariffs, and most of them have been reversed. There's a whole taco Trump thing going on about that. So my question is neoliberalism dead? Right? Maybe there's a crisis of neoliberalism, like there's people obviously unhappy with neoliberalism that may have brought Trump into power, but nevertheless, you've got Keir Starmer in the UK making hospitals compete on who gets funding, and if they don't perform well enough, then they'll get funding taken away from them. That seems like peak neoliberalism. Even Margaret Thatcher wouldn't have dreamed of that, right? So I guess my question is, where is this death knell for neoliberalism? And if so, what was the moment? What exactly, is it a crisis, is it a death, and what exactly are we in now if we're not in a neoliberal period anymore?
If you'd like to, please.
Well, you ask an interesting question, and for the past 40 years people have been telling me that capitalism is dead or neoliberalism is dead. It's not dead yet, and you're actually quite correct. Trump's policies are essentially in some part anti-neoliberal, essentially the emphasis on tariffs, the tighter financial reins and stuff like that, but they're all very personalised and so on for Trump. It's about, enriching him and his buddies and stuff like that. Is neoliberalism dead? I think as a practical economic theory, it's never held water and so on anyway. It's always been in perpetual crisis. But however, you raise an important point. Politically, I think it still remains very alive. Essentially, you see it in terms of the Keir Starmer. You see it, of course, in the actions of the present New Zealand government that has committed to actually, extending neoliberalism and flicking the switch back on from 1992. So I think it would be premature to say that somehow died. Certainly it is in crisis, but as I've said, I think it's always been in some form of crisis. The issue that I think is that the left still has not developed an alternative policy and so on that can actually combat neoliberalism.
Can I also just quickly say, I sort of agree with that too, but I think the bit of the neoliberal consensus that has collapsed is not the privatisation bit or the dismantling the public sector bit. It's the unbridled flow of capital bit that has collapsed. Like, I think that's the bit that is not the same anymore. Like, which is not to say that within the little blocks that we've ended up with now, that things are being renationalised or something like that. Absolutely not. Like, you're right. Like, if anything, it's increasing the pace of privatisation. But there is something in the consensus that has changed. Like, it's not as free-flowing as it was not that long ago. And that is interesting. That's, I don't think anyone said dead, actually. But, I think that's the bit of the consensus that is missing.
So when I would say that it is dead, in some sense, what is its crisis? I would say that in some sense you could talk about like modes of accumulation and capital. I'm somewhat less interested in that. For me, the crisis of neoliberalism is a crisis of its politics, and particularly the collapse of the sort of Nixon coalition, like the arrangement of like Labour on one side, racial minorities on there, Christian conservatives, like small business owners on one side. That's really the coalition that capitalism has formulated into sort of two camps. That is realigning quite quickly. And Trump, best expressed by Trump, but also by Bernie in some sense. And so I think Quentin said before that Trump was like the culmination of neoliberalism. But Trump was always sort of an anti-neoliberal. He was talking about tariffs in the 1980s. And similarly, he's a way in which someone from the beginning of an era comes at the end to rescue it, similarly to how Bernie was appealed. He was a New Dealist who would come at sort of the end of the welfare state to propose to regenerate it. Trump is sort of doing the same with neoliberalism. He's sort of a spectre of a previous politics. He's an 80s businessman, wants to return to the high profit yields of the 70s and 80s, etc. So it's a political crisis, and it manifests in the way that the Democrats and the left wants to reconstitute politics on the same basis that it was under the sort of previous 50 years of the Democrats.
I'll just be very brief. I think the term is best used as a very substantial ensemble of a very historical period, which was open borders, obviously favouring the West in the way they're opened, and that sort of thing, marketisation of internal institutional processes, marketisation of the culture, and that sort of thing. And really neoliberalism is a form of re-regulation, not deregulation. It regulates bodies and capital, labour, and that sort of thing, and it deregulates capital. In the 1970s, strikes in Australia were relatively easy to do. Secondary boycotts, closed shops, you could do all of that and have some legal protection. If you wanted to send $20,000 out of the country, you had to fill in 20 forms, and it took weeks and that sort of thing. So capital was regulated, and labour was less regulated. And one of the things neoliberalism is a swap of that. So capital becomes deregulated in certain ways, flows around and that sort of thing. Now, whether we then call this new regime, in which there is still the internal marketisation of all institutions, that will get worse, hospitals, universities, whatever, at the same time as economies are re-bordered and created as national economies once more, with inflows and outflows washed and that sort of thing. Whether we call that neoliberalism or not starts to be an analytical, theoretical question rather than a question of a real element out there.
I talk about universalism. Universalism. Yes, probably everyone here is committed to a kind of universalism. But as you use the word deregulate, see that, sorry, that's okay. Yeah. Neoliberal politics and economics has deregulated everything, but it's actually created a universalism. The universalism doesn't necessarily mean universal or collective equality, but it is enforcing a kind of universalism. I mean, I own a Toyota. I didn't buy it off Toyota. I bought it off a dealer up in Preston. When I watch movies, I don't go to the local. I get it streamed directly from California. And likewise, I mean, anyone in the subcontinent, apart from being cricket enthusiasts, they probably support Manchester United. This kind of globalism is a fact of life. It isn't just globalism, it's a kind of uniformity which includes the individualism that was fostered by neoliberalism. And I think that we need a politics which captures that universalism, which is being fostered by neoliberalism, or has been and continues to be, without insulting, in fact, the individualism that it's fostered, in fact, to harness it.
Just say something. I still think it is a process of re-regulation. Consider this, in the social democratic period, say the 70s, if you wanted to start an aged care home here, or whatever the thing was, you could pretty much hang out your shingle and just start shipping people in. Now, even in a neoliberal framework, the level of regulation that you have to fulfil is enormous. But here's what happens. The regulations themselves create the market. So what happens is private corporations then shape themselves to fulfilling those regulations. So regulation itself becomes a source of accumulation and value. And that's why you have these enormous childcare, private things and that sort of thing. The process of differential regulation of society produces commodities, and those commodities are these state objects. So that's why I think it's a mistake to just say that neoliberalism is old laissez-faire in new clothes. It's not. Neoliberalism is fundamentally about the state, and that's why the state hasn't got any smaller. Despite the Hayekian fantasies, the state just gets larger and larger, just doesn't do the same things it used to.
Agreed.
Yeah.
I'd perhaps say, Andy, that isn't unique to neoliberalism, but in a sense, people were speaking about the bourgeois cosmos in the 1780s, that soon people knew that everyone in the world was going to be in social relations, even if they never met, and that was what made them universal, that they would all be consumer producers or something, to use a Fisher language. But the universalism of bourgeois social relations is still there. Even it bursts through the seams at various moments, but it's been there for 250 years.
Can you be patient, Santa?
I don't feel patient. I need to go and have a piss. I hope the answers will be brief. Is it Chris, the second speaker?
Yeah.
I was really impressed by the fact that most of your talk was about the material basis, the economic developments that compelled it. And I believe that Guy Rundle also at least mentioned that the reason for the collapse of the Keynesian social democratic thing was the fact that the economy had gone down and that the neoliberalism grew out of that. But you gave a fairly detailed account of economic movements in a way that I can't follow at the speed you delivered it. I'd like to read it if you've written it somewhere. Have you got a reference that I can go to, or will you promise to write up your talk?
Sure. Yeah.
And it was also going into the issue of the export of globalization and the export of jobs. And everyone else talks about that just in terms of losing jobs from here. But my understanding is that the years you're talking about as being such misery for the left was the massive growth in jobs in the third world. You mentioned it in China, but it was also much more than that. And the massive change in income distribution. Like there's a famous elephant graph that gets quoted about the decline of the American middle class, that they're going backwards. And what it actually shows is that the third world poorest places that have benefited from the export of globalization and jobs have had a relative rise in living standards compared with the Western rise in living standards and Western stagnation in living standards. And those seem to be really important fundamental points compared with the discussion of most of the talk, including some of yours, as being focused on the culture from the point of view of people involved in cultural industries, and not, I think, from the point of view of most workers even in the Western world. Right? Most of the globe sees decades of progress. Most of the Western workers see no need for a left to improve their lot for reasons that I think Guy mentioned. And I'd like you to take up that proposition. There are a lot of people who think society improved as a result of the collapse of the Keynesian social democratic consensus. Right? They feel better off under the current thing. And I'll give a very quick answer to Guy's question about the reduced working week. I was a telecom liney at the time, and we got the 9-day fortnight, and we got it without struggle, as far as I know. It was just a deal arranged between the union and Telstra on the basis that they didn't know what work we actually did, because we worked outside without, the foreman has to drive around and see if you're actually there or not. And the deal was that they could find out what work we were doing, that we had to fill in forms about what we were actually doing, so that they could eventually start charting it and pressuring it and so on, which didn't affect me. I ceased to be a liney by then. But we got the 9-day fortnight before everybody else, without a struggle. And I can answer your question. It wasn't anything to do with needing the overtime. These were, I was on a ditch digging gang with Italian labourers who didn't particularly, had relatively high wages in Telstra compared with other ditch digging jobs. And all of them welcomed the 9-day fortnight. One of the non-Italian workers at the Lions Depot was an idiot. And he was really frustrated by, he didn't know what to do with his spare time, right? He resented having to find something to do that wasn't at work. And I think the change was related to the cultural change that Guy mentioned, that life was a lot more interesting when you didn't have 4 TV channels and when you had the internet, and, a whole lot of things happened that made life more global, with higher living standards, more international things. There were more people going to university, all kinds of stuff was happening that people found much more interesting than the boring social democrat politics that I grew up with when I was 14. Right? That the trade union leaders were really deadly boring people. Last thing, that global shift. It's very positive that jobs left the developed world, and it's very negative, the one that Chris mentioned, that they've shifted from globalisation to autarky and tariff wars and so on. That's going to be a really backward step, which, as was correctly mentioned by the others, is Trump carrying out the program of the anti-imperialists. Right, Trump saying we will put up our barriers to defend American jobs. You've got to be totally pro-imperialist to want to preserve a barrier to protect the workers of your own country to have higher living standards than the workers of much poorer countries. It's a classically, it's the definition of the concept of labour aristocracy, etc., is what this so-called left did stand for. And just a final question.
The question?
That's enough. There's too much there.
The question?
Final question for Chris. You mentioned Catroni analysis of Trump. I share that analysis to a large extent, and I wrote 60 articles on the fact that and it's the only thing I paid attention to in American politics and culture wars was that something new had happened when they elected Trump in 2016. I haven't paid attention nowadays. But right through his administration, I followed what was happening, and I was basically just writing 60 articles about the Democrats having gone batshit crazy. Trump had only one skill. He knew how to push their buttons and make their heads explode, and they regularly did it. It was bizarre.
I'm not sure what the question. Chris, did you answer that?
There's a lot there.
Will you be publishing?
Sure, yeah, I can email you something. Yeah, maybe. I think maybe on the question of the US-China thing, just quickly, I think there's something very historically specific about that relationship. That is the reason I wanted to mention it in the opening kind of comment, because I think it's not really generalizable to like humanity as a whole. It's sort of like a really specific historic moment of like crisis in the West, sort of a political crisis in China, needs being met in a really like complex and weird way that is kind of interesting, but the limits...
Now moving to the rest of Asia. The jobs are moving out of China towards Bangladesh.
That's true, but that's true. I mean, I think the limits of that balance have now been exposed, I think. And I think that's what's brought us to the moment today. That was the point I was trying to make, that I think it's... it can't go on forever. It's finished. Like that balance the balance of financial terror, as it was called, is done. And that's kind of why we're all in this in-between moment now, right? Of like what happens now.
I just respond quickly. The push to tariffs and also the push to migration limits, borders, that sort of thing, is clearly not just a sectoral class, national economic push. It's a push, as I say, between this division between the intellectually trained who want a certain type of full cosmopolitanism, if you like, and other classes who want more of a ground to their lives. And there is this strong sense, as the velocity of change has sped up in recent years, of a complete ungrounding of your life. And one of the ways in which people did have a grounding within the industrial era was that, there was a factory in their town or that sort of thing, which made things, came out the front door, that sort of thing. And so there was a materiality to that, which in its absence has created the vacuum in which someone like Trump can step and promise that. So it's not simply an economic thing, it's a deep cultural thing.
This is to Quentin and Guy. So we've kind of come to the conclusion that this post-neoliberalism will be like privatisation at home, but sort of restricted markets abroad. How do you think sort of the establishment parties of New Zealand, so Labour National, and then Australia, Labour Liberal, will respond to this sort of US, Europe change in the political economy, I guess?
Well, I mean, the establishment party of New Zealand, Christopher Luxon, said that they had no problems with that, but believed in free marketing and free trade nonetheless, and that Winston Peters has said that essentially whatever Trump did was cool with him. So essentially that has been the sort of schizophrenic sort of reaction of the National Party and New Zealand First and so on throughout this. My feeling is that essentially that National has already indicated, and the government has indicated, that it still stands with free trade. So I don't think it'll be reversing that policy at any point in the immediate future. And Labor is still committed to free trade, so I can't see it reversing that either. So.
I think I think one of the things that this tariff stuff does is reveal the economic structure of the world, which is that smaller nations talk resistance and a big game initially when Trump announces a tariff, and then go around the back door and make whatever deals they can to keep the tariffs as low as possible, to keep the market open. I think I think the reason that Australia has a bit more leeway than a lot of countries, because we're still just a giant quarry. We have this we have this enormous resources load in multiple forms of minerals and that sort of thing, which we can sell to multiple markets, and which in turn has left us once again to be underdeveloped in terms of our own economy. So we're exposed in terms of imports and that sort of thing, but we're in a relatively more advantageous position than a lot of other countries. And I think you can see that in the politics, that the Labor government is not worrying terribly about the optics of Trump, doing this and that and the other, and when the threat to for the tariffs on pharmaceuticals came up as a deliberate attempt to attack the pharmaceutical benefits scheme, Labor just piled in and said the pharmaceutical benefits scheme is non-negotiable. So So, and you know, as you can see in News Corp and that sort of thing, what they're trying to do as a political wedge to Labor is to say, oh, you know, Albanese's not meeting with the president, it's a crisis, that sort of thing, and it's having no traction at all as far as I can see. So I think the resources position leaves Labor in a good position that way.
I was just wanting to ask, earlier in the discussion, you were talking about how there was kind of a cultural shift against neoliberalism with the rise of thinkers like Zizek and Bernie Sanders gaining popularity. But I was wondering, would that really be the case when promptly after that their ideas were kind of commodified and used to again further neoliberal agendas? For example, Israel being marketed as this kind of LGBT safe haven, and then the production of media like, I don't know, Wall-E, Astro Boy, whatever, like the Disney one, that kind of, use this rise of socialism to get profit and whatever. How would you kind of think, how would you say you can, like the left can have these kind of countercultural ideas and have them be long-lasting without neoliberalism reshaping them to support itself, I guess.
Can I just jump in? Just really quick point. I hope I didn't make it seem like I was saying Bernie Sanders' ideas are the best and like the project is amazing and it's going to work or whatever. Actually, I think his ideas are like super basic. I think the potential of it was the mobilization of people around distributional questions, and then what they bounce off that to do is kind of the question you're asking, right? I think, and that is organizational. I mean, there's constantly new calls for like new parties to, whether that's like a mass workers party or mass left party or something like that, or some people go in a more like sectarian direction or whatever. But I do think that organizational question is the key one in answer to your question. Like, what do we do with the momentum that has been created over the past 10 years or whatever? If we're all just like floundering around separately, I don't think it's going to do much. If we all join the parties of capital, the Democrats, the Labour Party, that's obviously not going to do anything either. So yeah, I think that's the question for the moment. I don't really have an answer for that, but I think that's the question we have to ask and answer to avoid the situation of it all just being for nothing. That's my opinion anyway.
I think that's a good question. I think in the history of left, but even particularly in Marxism as well, there has always emerged strains of people who say they are Marxists who advocate for a politics of a kind of regeneration of the state, the power of the state. And it certainly was the case for the Millennial Left that started happening towards, say, 2013, 2014, 2015, that as the various sort of social tensions arise, for example, like the Black Lives Matter movement or the Me Too movement, these were used under the language of just Marxism, so like a Marxist feminism or a decolonial Marxism, was used to chastise those who were more critical of the Sanders run, but particularly the Democrats. In some sense that there was a justification for the white Bernie bros wanted to have socialism where we needed to guarantee the state to supply various welfare programs and things like this. And that was done on the basis of Marxism. So there was socialists of Marxism who would use those ideas. And so the battleground wasn't always Marxism, but there was a left battleground over the relation of our thought to the politics. And that remains contested to this day.
For me, the crucial thing to remember is that for a long time in the 20th century, we had high capitalism, whatever, a class society dominated by the battle of the two great classes. Intellectuals, the intellectually trained, were off to the side as a small subgrouping and went into, they emerged as individuals from either the working class or the middle class, and then a section of them would ally with the working class movement and serve it. And that's the whole debate goes forward for decades about what is the relation of intellectuals to class form. Now, as you get automation, intellect, that sort of thing, the plugging in of all these factors, the intellectuals and the intellectually trained are the ruling class of the future. They're in the waiting room. At the current moment, they're in alliance with capitalism, with Silicon Valley, that sort of thing. Hitherto, they're in alliance with the state, but really, the pulse beneath these grand historical transformations is the expansion of intellect, technology, technosciences, automation, and the cultural side of things, which becomes a technology of social management and technological creation. So what you have really, when you're talking about the commodification and co-option of intellectual practices and intellectual processes is that it is in the class interest, if you call them a class, of that group, distinct from and separate to the working class or the middle class. They have their own interests now. And it's vital to recognise that you can't just see anymore the intellectuals and the intellectually trained as a subclass or subgroup in service to a class politics. The great contradiction and division of our time is that there's a lot of Marxists in the intellectual strata, and the working class in the West don't want a bar of us. They don't want anything we're selling. And looking at a socialist mayor baby being elected in New York is the rule-proving exception for this. You know what New York is. It's this incredible multicultural, intellectual, etc. city. But Kansas City, Idaho, that sort of thing. There's nothing's happening in that way. So we have to look at the vital thing to do at the moment is to reconstruct the class analysis and group analysis of society and look at the way in which these processes are transforming the most basic processes of accumulation and the base and that sort of thing. And that's where a new politics will arise. So that is the key thing at the moment, because the rest of it is really, in the ways that Albert was saying, the rest of it is really over.
Can I just add one thing very quickly to what Guy said? In 2014, Thomas Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century, something like, came out, and it was a big hit amongst the millennials. It was kind of the new version of Capital. It was a big Marxist text everyone celebrated. Elizabeth Warren, who was my senator at the time in Boston, she hosted a sort of town hall in the Old South Meeting House, the revolutionary town hall in Boston, with Thomas Piketty, talking about the ills of capitalism, sort of needs for socialism, bankruptcy reform, the left and the Democrats need to get on board in order to incorporate Piketty's ideas. And then a few years later, she gave the sort of fatal blow to Bernie on one of the debate stages, that he was like against women because he was sort of didn't encourage Elizabeth Warren to run. And that was kind of a synthesis for me, where I realized that even the Marxists, or the Marxists who were getting soaked into the Democrats, could sort of mobilize a kind of attack like this.
Quentin?
No, I'm okay. I've got nothing more to add to what the panelists have said. So.
Thank you, right now.
Okay, this is on. Yes, it is. Okay, I have a chronic inability to phrase a succinct question, so hopefully you can deal with me and just ask me to clarify if I'm being in any way obscure. So just to zoom out, I want to consider neoliberalism in epochal terms. There's a tendency perhaps to treat neoliberalism in reified, particular, granular, maybe policy terms, judging it by effects instead of also its causes. And I want to prompt the panelists to consider what neoliberalism has meant as a phenomenon of capitalism, which is to say, how far do its roots go? Is it really just a 20th century phenomenon? Or is it an extension of a crisis that is much older? What does this have to do with Marx's critique of capitalism in the 19th century? One might also ask, what was liberalism? What crisis did liberalism convey? And what made it appropriable by the so-called ideologues of neoliberalism, who sought to recover certain aspects of it, laissez-faire and the rest. And what did politics have to do with this? Often neoliberalism is talked about as destroying civil society perhaps in kind of a narrow sense, like destroying its institutions. But in order to invoke this, we have to use the terms of liberalism. We have to think about civil society in the broader sense. And this reminds me of the debate between this kind of Daniel Bell versus Ernest Mandel kind of discussion of the post-war years about industrial capitalism versus, late capitalism versus industrial society. What has been wrought by the post-war order, and is it all really capitalism anymore? I suppose, to summarise then, my question would be, even if neoliberalism is dead, what difference has it made for the left?
It's a big question.
Maybe I'll just respond very quickly. In some sense, the Zoomers will learn about neoliberalism from the Millennials. They won't necessarily look back to Gen X. That may just be a kind of historical phenomenon, but the way that Millennials tell their experience to Zoomers will matter for how the Zoomers will perceive transformations in capitalist politics. There have always been transformations in capitalist politics, and the left would need to be in some sense ahead of those transformations, or at least keeping up with them, in order to have any kind of possibility of overcoming them. And certainly the experience of the Millennial Left is that we were behind them, and that's very broadly. Does anyone else want to respond now?
Well, maybe just super quickly, like I think one of the really positive things about the last 10 years is that, and the sort of millennial experience in what has not been a super successful project so far, but at least has little hints of something good happening, is that like distributional questions are back on the agenda, and I think that's going to help the next generation make sense of all this that's just happened. I mean, I don't think neoliberalism, or what we call neoliberalism, started because, I'm sort of repeating myself a bit here, but it started because someone was like, oh, I wrote a book and this was my idea. Like, it started because there was a serious profitability crisis in capitalism, and really what they wanted to do was restore, I said this before, but I'll just say it again, sorry to be repetitive, restore that kind of like reserve army of labour to its kind of disciplinary role. And I think that in the years when I grew up, and I don't know about the Gen Xers in the panel, but actually that whole idea had been totally like naturalised, I think. Like if you think about today, like when the Reserve Bank makes a decision about inflation or something like that, often those decisions are about like putting people into unemployment, but they make it sound like it's natural, right? So I think that whole concept has been, in the neoliberal period, really naturalised in people's mind. It was in mine, definitely. And I think what's changed in the past 10 years, which is super positive, is that suddenly we can start to think about all these big decisions that have been made historically and today as questions of like a distributional struggle. Like even inflation is a kind of distributional struggle between like whether, like who will accept fewer profits or lower wages or higher wages or whatever. Like, and I think that's, I really think that is a seismic shift from when I grew up anyway. Like all this stuff that was seen as, part of nature in the neoliberal period is now seen more as a conflictual distributive question, that's positive.
I think a concept like neoliberalism is only useful if you regard it as both, in some ways a real out there and in other ways a framing thing which has multi-leveled complexity. Yes. So, and the usefulness of these concepts as complex particulars is to make visible what is historical and contingent and what is deeper structural. So, for example, if in 1975 you had said that a hospital should run its accounting, marketing, etc. principles in the same mode as a restaurant or a 7-Eleven, everybody would have thought you were mad, absolutely mad, left or right. Now, everybody thinks like that. Now, why do they think like that when they run hospitals, when they market a hospital, when they do all this, when it's consolidated into broader capital, when it's, all this sort of thing, is because there's been levels of educational training, masters in public policy, all these sorts of ideological transformations within economic schools. At the same time, there's been changes in regimes of accumulation of what's commodifiable, technological changes, and all those sorts of things. It's an enormously complex web of things. Whether there is still a thing called neoliberalism, or whether the separate units that made that up, which is globalization, free trade, or open border trade going in one way, commodification of previously non-commodified institutions, all those sorts of changes, whether those 10 or 12 elements that make up neoliberalism are still enough in place to say there's still a thing called neoliberalism, ultimately becomes a methodological question. Sometimes the answer would be yes, sometimes it's no. So it is in turn related to what you want to achieve, what your political strategy is. You work back from the strategy to say, well, what's real and what's unreal. So it becomes a methodological question in that way.
Yeah, I think that just to draw your point and so on, and I mean, it does come back to what I was saying before and what you've actually said too about the shifting political sort of consensus and so on over the past 50 years. And, your point about hospitals is well made. I mean, in New Zealand, of course, you remember that the national government in 1992 actually did create hospitals to compete against each other. And, at that time it was seen as outlandish, but now, of course, essentially people accepted it. They accepted it as more. And I think that in terms of neoliberalism, there is, as I said too, I mean, some of the terms, are very, very, the philosophies underpinning it are very old. You talk about individual property rights, you talk about free trade and protectionism. These were all the rage about 150 years and so on ago. And I mean, even the economics that makes up neoliberalism, was last in vogue prior to the Great Depression. So, I mean, it's all there. It's been rehashed to a certain degree and put anew, but it was, it's come from a very, very old precept.
It's interesting in that you've emphasised the continuity of these kind of ideas when previous kind of panellists like Guy was sort of bringing into question whether this is like a contiguous moment, right? Like distancing it from the earlier free market liberalism or whatever, in the sense of its application. Do you make anything of that?
Yeah, I've always thought that basically I've come to the conclusion more and more that in fact, the roots are continuous. And that in fact, that you only need to look at, for example, politics 150 years ago when they were discussing much the same questions as we're actually discussing now. And so I think that's always actually been there. It's been rehashed and revamped, but definitely, it's been there and so on like that. And when you look at the reaction, for example, in New Zealand, where there was they removed meal breaks. The previous national government removed the right of actually having meal breaks for workers. The incoming Labour government restored those rights, and you read some of the statements that were coming out from the employers, and it was amazing. It was like, for example, you were declaring that communism had been declared, and some of the statements they were making were just astounding, and it was over the issue of meal breaks. And then you put them aside, so the same statements made by the Employers' Federation 100 years ago about breaks, about rights, about women working in the workplace and so on. It's the same sort of hysterics that actually occur.
But there is a difference, okay? The legitimacy of the master's employer's right to dispose of the employee as they saw fit back in the day in the 20s, resisted by the labour movement, resisted, that sort of struggle, had a certain right to it. The master could sack whoever they pretty much wanted. Now we have a situation where on the one hand you have, precarious employment and neoliberal economy, but you then have unfair dismissal laws, and those are universally accepted and they're in place. So if you are dismissed, you can actually go to a tribunal and get... So that old relationship with the master and servant has changed. These ensembles change. All this stuff about communism and that sort of thing is a certain type of noise and propaganda, isn't it? There aren't the roots of legitimacy for those sorts of ideas in the society now. You know, if you're sexually harassed at work, you have a tribunal. You know, back before 1985, if a boss made a pass at a worker and the worker resisted it, he just sacked her, and there's fuck all you could do about it. So these things are pretty substantial changes in the idea of the legitimacy of property and capital and what it can do and what it can't do and what sort of right there is that exists external to the market.
Can I just have a brief response to that? I take your point, and I hate to say this, but in New Zealand we see Australia as far more enlightened, okay, because our new Minister of Labour, Brooke Van Valen, is about to get rid of those rights. She's about to actually pass laws that will remove the right, for example, of personal grievances. She is about to actually to give the employers the right of firing at will. So you're quite right to say here in Australia, definitely, but I think this is a forebringer and so on of what is to actually come. You know, the incoming national government or the current national government is committed to actually restoring rights that would actually be 19th century in vogue. So while I take your point, you know, essentially these sort of things are already happening in New Zealand.
Yeah, you're right. It's a side of struggle because one of the interesting, I'll say this very quickly, one of the interesting things about the appeal of certain new right-wing parties like Maloney's Brothers of Italy and the Reform Party in the UK is that they're different to an earlier, like 5 or 10 years ago, right-wing European parties which took the social democratic contract, rolled it into the old nationalist, ethno-nationalist thing. So the Danish People's Party, which stole a march on the Social Democrats, kept the social democracy of Denmark, added limits to immigration and, ethnic Danishness and that sort of thing, put it together. Now, the interesting thing about Reform and Brothers of Italy is that they are putting in neo-Thatcherite policies together with this limits on migration and that sort of thing. And despite the fact that these are obviously inimical to working people, they are still getting large degrees of support from sections of the working class. Now that probably relates partly to increasing divisions in the working class related to property and asset holding and a fundamental division. People like Lisa Atkins have done a lot of work on that, University of Sydney, but it also does seem to relate to an obscuring of the class politics that people won't realise what they got till it's gone. So yeah, so I agree with you.
Can I just add one thing to that as well, for a second time? When Lenin, we're speaking of 120 years ago, when Lenin said that imperialism was at the highest stage of capitalism, and that actually carried some significance. Whereas today when we say, if one was to say neoliberalism was a stage of capitalism, it feels somewhat fake, like there's a kind of vanishing quality to it, it doesn't really hold up. And that was because of two factors. One, of the very large and widespread global movement for socialism. But two, particularly because there was a party. Right? There was a party, a Marxist party, who understood its role to render the outside external world of capital and its economic qualities, which seemed like a purely objective external reality. This is what's happening, how can we make sense of this? It rendered those external qualities into something subjective, particularly as a political form, that imperialism was a kind of politics that could be challenged in the imperial cause through the activity of the party. And so that's why, without the party today, we are left in a kind of ghost vanishing world of what actually is the mode of capitalism. In fact, what can one actually say about capitalism without it being rendered subjective politically through a party?
Cool. Just to flag, we do have time for one more, but I believe that'll take us through our time. So if we could just...
There's a chap up there who hasn't had
That's right, yeah.
Sorry.
All right, thanks for your time this afternoon. So my question may be a bit vibey and hopefully not too superficial, but really it relates to the question of meeting people where they are. Abundance guru Ezra Clown, right? He's talking about attention being a veritable new factor of production, right? And so I'm sort of just wondering what you guys make of the question of attention, given some of the broader intergenerational themes that have been spoken about here. and around the status of contemporary capitalism.
Attention. I don't know. I mean, I guess that then is largely a preoccupation of people who work in, the intellectually trained, the culture, etc. industries. I mean, one of the changes, I guess, in capitalism and in class relations is that in the classical Taylorist period, whether it was manual labour or routine office labour, work didn't want your whole subjectivity. You just had to come in, and the whole point of Taylorism was to remove the individual variation of the worker, so someone could just come in and hit a piece of metal for 8 hours and then go home. Now, the absolute change in terms of the growth of the new jobs, new sectors and that sort of thing, is it wants your whole subjectivity. You must bring your innovation, your ideas, all that sort of thing. So it's new levels of exploitation in that way. And I guess that becomes a side of struggle if you can say to people, well, you deserve a better deal. I mean, things like, being able to not answer phone calls after work hours have become real campaigns which have gained a real measure of support. The political point for me to make would be, once again, that you cannot use a simple class framework to say that people in the relatively routinized labour sectors of the working class and people in the increasingly complex sectors of the intellectually trained and the intellectuals are all one class, and or all one grouping which could be straightforwardly united by trying to get them to ignore their superstructural differences and look at their base commonalities. I think that's over, and how we organise these multiple different groupings and classes is the real strategic question of our time, because if you don't answer it, and I'm looking at the Marxist and left journals, nobody is really talking about what the working class is. Now, nobody's really talking about how it's composed and that sort of thing. And in the absence of that, in the process of just invoking the working class, they just keep going to the right. They just keep going to the right because the right talks about what they want and what they need. So that's something coming from that for me.
Really short question.
I'm afraid not.
In the pub, Albert. In the pub.
Okay, I'll do it in the pub.
One more. And then let's just quickly, if we can, and then we can get through some more.
I'm just wondering, should you be paying just as much attention to criticising reformism and social democracy? I mean, that's the other problem.
Can you speak into it a bit louder, Dave?
I was just saying, shouldn't you be paying equal attention to the problem of reformism and social democracy? We don't want people walking away thinking that the bourgeois state is the solution to their problems. And also distinguish the difference between Marxism and radical politics and reformism. This is totally blurred in this discussion.
I think that's true. I agree with that. I mean, I think there's a commonality, right, between the nominally redistributive wings of like what's going on in the US today, I suppose, like on the, I already said I don't really think MAGA is redistributive, maybe aesthetically redistributive or something, like pretending to be under Steve Bannon's direction. But actually I think the interesting commonality between both of those projects, MAGA and the US Sanders style like social democracy thing, is it's kind of like their sights are set so low in terms of what they will accept as good that like it's almost like reform isn't even on the agenda in any serious way. It's like reformism without reforms. It's like just talking or grandstanding or something. Like I think most people, whether they're working class or like petty bourgeois, like shopkeepers or something, in the MAGA thing, I think most of them would probably accept just being able to, I don't know, use a racial slur at work or something. I actually think that would be like, yeah, that's fine. That's enough. And on the social democratic left, most of them would be happy, not with a reform. I think that would be amazing if they would be happy with the reform, but just getting someone elected who does nothing. I think that's the crazy quirk of the moment. So I totally agree with you. I think reformism is not the answer, but I don't think that's what's happening. I think there's sights. I think neoliberalism, whatever it was, has set everyone's sights so low that in both the kind of polarizations of it, there's not even reformism there. It's like a nothing. It's like just an empty kind of thing. But I do think one wing has more potential towards something better than the other one, obviously.
I mean, there is no... What there was pre the neoliberal period there was revolutionary strata in the working class in the 70s and 80s when you went to marches or debates and that sort of thing. You could talk to building workers still, metal workers, that sort of thing, who were who knew their Marx, who knew their Mao, who talked in those terms. It wasn't just intellectuals and it wasn't just union leaders. And that just doesn't exist. So there's no other to reformism, and there's no reformism, But they're just like there's no point criticising reformism.
Free software movement. Communist. They've expropriated all the intellectual property in the world.
Yeah, but that's completely...
You can get it free now.
Yeah, but that's completely different.
Think about the free software movement, a communist movement that is actually functioning.
Yeah, but you can't eat software, Albert. You can't eat software.
No, you can think with it.
Yeah,
Workers
great.
have access to all the information in all the world's libraries free.
No, they don't. It's rubbish.
Yeah, but socialism was about the means of life, not just
communists.
Oh, yeah, but it's easy to have a communist layer with dematerialised things. The difficulty in socialism is to get tomatoes, not software. That's the point. It's an easy thing, and that's why there's no...
engineers are unemployed, you'll find out that they're communists.
All right. Okay, I'll try and follow on from that. This question is for anyone, but it's sort of designed to be like deliberately a bit provocative. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought. I did write it down. Sorry. So there's no doubt that in the world for workers in the West, like poverty and inequality still exist. But at the same time, there's also no doubt that materially workers in the West live better lives than ever before, and we have more comfort, more technology, more choice, etc., than all the previous generations of workers before us. So my question is, with this in mind, is the project of the left still relevant in the 21st century?
Yeah, okay, I'll go quickly. Well, the left, whether it's relevant or not, it keeps appearing, right? As a form of appearance of a kind of critical consciousness in society, that people think that society changes in a way that people might be able to participate in. And that is because ultimately society is changing. And as society changes, people feel that subjectively they can contribute to it. And that has been essentially the last 300 years of human history. So the left will be there. It will also be a confusing force. It will be sometimes a right? And it's hard to tell which is which sometimes. And that's why the inquiry into the left remains as a task for the 21st century.
Certainly a big part of looking at the predicament of now is to look at what the left was going right back to the 1820s and 1830s when the left we would recognise starts to emerge. And that is looking at what was the composition of intellectuals and working classes and how did they combine, how much of the left was a projection on to the working classes. Obviously a vast working class movement, but how much of it was actually always somewhat conservative and had a more emancipatory and transformative project projected onto it. And I think, disinterring that, re-examining how those different parts fitted together will give you different answers, will give you a different history of the left, and something that probably gets you beyond this question of whether the left as a single sort of abstraction. The only other thing to say quickly is that, yeah, things have got better, you know, in terms of, as I've been saying, other people have been saying, but in the last 50 years, it's more like the dimension, the two sides of consumption have changed for workers and middle classes, the necessities and the luxuries. You know, in the 1970s, rent was 10% of your income, but to buy a TV cost you a month's work, and you had to get it repaired, and it was a valuable object and that sort of thing. You know, international airfares, all these sorts of luxuries were much more discretionary items. There was much less. Now, those are the things that have got cheaper. This is the smashed avocado stuff, while the basic means of life have become increasingly unaffordable. So we've got to look at that paradox and say that in many ways, as we were talking about, yeah, life was a bit boring in the 60s and 70s in many ways compared to what it became, but it was also a lot more secure in other ways than it isn't now.
Yeah, actually I think the first part of your question is the maybe more interesting way to phrase it, because if you read, whether you read like radical left publications or Jacobin or the financial press, the consensus actually is the same. Life's getting worse, not better. Actually, that's across the board. Like increased insecurity, anxiety, like everyone thinks that. So I think, yeah.
And that's part of the appeal of the abundance thing,
yeah.
And the yimbies and that sort of thing. These are easy answers, you know, simple idea that if you just open the floodgates, all this stuff will happen. And one of the answers about neoliberalism as a system of regulation is it just won't, you know, so it's a fake.
I think that in the 1950s, J.K. Galbraith wrote a book called The Age of Affluence in the 1960s. And he was talking at that point, of course, about the post-war, post-war increase in wages and so on like that, which enabled people to buy things, luxuries, that they'd never actually had before. I'm thinking, of course, of refrigerators and cars and stuff like that. And I think now, I mean, just to take your point, I mean, despite what some people have said here, wages overall throughout the West, and, you know, again, you know, I can only refer to New Zealand, have actually fallen in the past 40 to 50 years. So in fact, you know, when you actually talk about, you know, essentially what people can afford, we can afford less than what our parents or our grandparents actually bought when they actually had wages and so on like that. So, and again, too, I think the entire illusion about choice, you know, this is the one thing that was always sold to us, oh, well, you have more choice. You know, you have a choice between McDonald's and Burger King or something like that. That's not a choice. You know, these things are choices I can do without. Okay, I mean, you know, when you're actually talking about choice, I want to, you know, I think the choice should be, you know, essentially the ability and so on to find a job or the ability to actually find a good house or so on like that. So I think that, you know, the left and so on overall is still about, you know, finding control. It's still about, you know, essentially enabling real choice and so on for people and so on the left. So.
Thank you. Cool, thank you very much. So I think we'll have to draw a line under there for time, but I'd like to thank all of our panelists once more. And I'd just like to remind everyone that there will be an event at the Clyde afterwards. If anyone would like to join us, we will all be there. So,
And tomorrow.
And tomorrow as well.
1:30.
At 1:30. And yeah, sorry.
What have you got here?
An interview with the IBT.
Yes. Sorry, just to clarify that, as you really pointed out, at 1:30 today in the same venue, we'll have an interview with the IB team. So come through to that if you're available. Thank you. Thanks.
Right, good. It's New Zealand.
Yeah, we're flipping over.
I knew they existed now. It's like discovering the city.
Chris, are we going to head to the Clyde or are we going to go?
Yeah, I'll come next
Oh, hell yeah. You did